Hold on, make sure we're going. No, that's my kid. We are recording. Excellent. Okay. Welcome back to the Common Denominator. I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. With the IDF operation reaching deeper into Rafah and the outrage machine setting itself at full blast, we meet the train wreck du jour of the deep misunderstanding of the people and forces driving them in this region. This Monday, May 27th, Egyptian forces opened fire on Israeli soldiers at the Rafah Crossing. At least one Egyptian soldier died in the exchange. Prior to this, an Israeli businessman was murdered in Alexandria in early May. And on October 8th, two Israeli tourists were killed along with their local guide, also in Alexandria. Prior to these, 3 IDF soldiers were shot dead in another attack on the Egyptian border in June 2023. It was the first deadly exchange of fire along the Israel-Egypt border in over a decade. The backdrop of these incidents, The backdrop of these incidents is Israel and Egypt who are sliding into a peace accord strained like never before. And to that effect, we wish to gain an understanding of just what's going on and what are its implications. Joining us today is Khaled Hassan, a Jewish Egyptian British counterterrorism researcher. His research interests include propaganda, anti-Semitism in the Arab world, terrorism, and extremism. He leads the Western Security Network, a not-for-profit established to promote Western national security interests and counter the threat of extremism, as well as authoritarian expansionist states. He can be reached on Twitter at Khaled H. Zakaria. Khaled, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's delightful to be here.
It's great to have you. I've seen a lot of your discussion online. Let's just start off first by learning about you, as you have an entirely unique story and perspective. Khaled, tell us, where did you grow up, and give us the trajectory in a nutshell, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. So I've been telling this story quite a lot more often for the past couple of months, actually. So please do feel free to interrupt me and ask if I seem to be saying it like it's a very ordinary thing. Because I was telling someone not long ago, and I said at some stage, and I said, "Oh, and I converted to Judaism," and then I went on like it's the most, sort of like the a very ordinary thing that everyone does. Yes. Probably because I've been talking about it for a lot, so a lot. So yeah. So I was born in Cairo in 1990 in a neighborhood called Maadi. Maadi is actually a very, in a way, somewhat exclusive neighborhood. It's a neighborhood where you have the residence of the Israeli ambassador, where you have a synagogue actually, an old synagogue, which is, you don't really have that in many parts of Egypt. It's again somewhat of a closed community, nicer community than many parts of Cairo. So I was born to a very, ordinary middle class Egyptian Muslim family. And they sent me to an American school basically. So I learned, French, English, German, from such a young age. And I think when I look back, as they say, you can only link the dots looking backwards. When I look back, I realized, what, this was actually a huge thing for me because it made me able to go ahead and question the narrative that I was being fed at home, to find sources, for instance, on the Yom Kippur War that were not actually available around me in Arabic speaking sources. So that's how, that's my life basically. And I went to study, which is again a very middle class thing, studying business administration and economics. This was my my what I specialized in as an undergrad student. But then I realized, no, I actually feel like I really belong studying something related to public affairs or international relations and politics. And this is where it all started. I actually started reaching out to the United Nations Volunteers Program, United Nations Development Program, which were huge things in Egypt when it comes to actually uh, helping achieve some goals, when it comes to economic and development sustainability. And it started from there really. I got interested more and more in international relations and Arab-Israeli conflict. I think, to be honest, every Egyptian is somewhat interested in the Arab-Israeli conflict, obviously for very different reasons than myself. But I was very interested. I started to also develop an interest in diplomacy. I wanted to be a diplomat at some point because I believed, Egypt needed people to represent it, people who are actually capable of speaking English, people who are actually capable of reaching out, and I was doing really well on that front. And it's actually quite fascinating because when I look back, I realized, I was just, a young guy. And whenever I reached out to any senior European diplomat or, American diplomat and, wanted to discuss the Arab Peace Initiative or, all that stuff, I almost immediately got a very interested response. And I always wondered why. Now that I'm, here in the UK, I think I understand why, because it's so rare to find someone in Egypt or the Arab world who's actually really interested in building bridges, somebody who's really interested in, having being involved on a personal level in peace building with the Israelis. So now I know why, because now I myself actually look for Arabs and Egyptians who are interested in this because I want to build bridges with them as somebody who's now, in the UK, as somebody who's part of the Jewish community, because I want to take this further. So yes, this is how it started. I got really involved in many political initiatives, and I think the what was for me actually a turning point was the Arab Spring in 2011. So the protests all over Cairo, the protests all over Egypt, and pretty much the entire, all of North Africa. Um, and that was really huge for me because it was a point where I got to see many things like never before. For instance, the fact that most Egyptians support the Camp David peace treaty, but they only support it in the sense that, yes, we don't want war with Israel, but we also don't want peace. So that's, it's this state of no war, no peace. So that's basically what Egyptians really preferred. And for me, that was staggering because I felt like, why not take Egypt to the next stage, of actually building an alliance, of actually building, good relationship with Israel, where, you can travel freely to Israel, where, all that stuff, which was naive. Looking back, I think it was very naive. So yes, I mean, I got interested in like I said, diplomacy, and I ended up actually working with two former ministers of foreign affairs in Egypt. Those two are actually very consequential for Egyptian foreign policy over decades. So I learned a lot from them. The only reason I don't name names is because obviously I don't think they would be very happy with my position, and that would actually put them in a position in Egypt where they are seen in a very, at least controversial way. Which I don't want to do this to them. It's not. I don't think it's the right thing to do. But I did learn a lot. I mean, one of them, for instance, and I was talking about this not long ago with a friend. I said, why don't we go to Gaza? Why don't we go and see, some Palestinian politicians that we both knew? And I said, why don't we go and see them, and engage in debate, engage in discussions. And he said to me, if I went there, Hamas would kill me. And that's an Egyptian former minister of foreign affairs. And that's a lot of, these are aspects that I think most Egyptians do not actually know. These are things that most Egyptians do not. They're not really told about that side of Palestinian nationalism. They're not really told about how President Sadat, his death when he was assassinated, was actually celebrated by many Palestinians, including some of the biggest names in Palestinian politics. And I think it's for some reason it's a bit of a you have a situation where the government knows stuff, but they can't actually publicly say these opinions because if they do, they will be accused of treason. So what the government does is reinforce these misconceptions, reinforce all this disinformation, all these conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, because it's a very cheap and easy way to win public support, to be seen as a nationalist, a patriot. So if a politician is given the choice between peace with Israel, actual peace with Israel, or actually even discussing this publicly, or saying Israel is the ultimate enemy. Israel, is everything that we go through is because of Zionists and all that nonsense. Sadly, they will go with the latter choice because they want to be seen as a patriot, not as a traitor, and be entirely shunned by society. So yeah, I got involved with a lot of organizations, the Arab League, the most senior diplomats in the Arab League, the EU in Egypt actually, and obviously the State Department and the U.S. Embassy in Cairo.
Wow. So what happened? When did you This is interesting. What about you? It might be something we get into later. Was able to even have the desire to build bridges. Isn't that opposite of what the general population felt?
I always say yes, it is, but I always say it's actually a mix of being very curious and also having an appetite for risk, a large appetite for risk. Because I think for me there was this sense of why not? Who are the Jews? That I'm being told that I must be really scared of. Like who are those? Who are those people? What's this Star of David? I mean, the Star of David is seen in Egypt as something really scary. Like when people look at it, it's a mix of fear, suspicion, hate. It's a very powerful state of mind actually, and I think it's actually in a way you will see that this conflict and anti-Semitism generally has been driven a lot by symbols, as actually visual symbols, whether it's the swastika, which is obviously again something that a lot of people have very strong feelings about because obviously the Holocaust, and then you have Nazis who obviously glorify this symbol. So I think it's fascinating, and I think this actually needs to be explored further. But one thing that really did, I think, looking back, changed who I am. For 1 year, so my parents were separated. They got separated, and for 1 year, my dad decided, you know what, I'm just going to be difficult with everyone, and he decided to take me out of my school and send me to a public school, so a state school. And that state school was right across the road from Al Basatin Jewish Cemetery, which is the second oldest Jewish cemetery in the world. I think that's actually something that a lot of Jews do not even know. It's in Cairo, and it's the second oldest Jewish cemetery, and it's fascinating. History is fascinating, and I've written about this repeatedly. And I saw how people treat this. I saw how people, vandalize this. I saw how people do all sorts of horrific things just to graves of Jews. It's not even a Jew who's alive. It's not even a Jew who, could do you any harm. It's not even a Jew who's a Zionist. It's a dead Jew. And even that, it's they were not spared of, the vandalism and the anti-Semitism and the horrific anti-Semitism. So that was also another, again, milestone and I think turning point in my life when I saw this. But that also made me develop this interest in actually, knowing more about this society. And I think it was 2014 when I joined. It was an EU-funded public diplomacy initiative, basically, which was meant to bring Egyptian youth with Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, and it was those four groups of people met in Cyprus for about a week. It was basically everyone staying in one hotel, everyone talking in one, having meetings all day, and then going out for drinks. I think what I found fascinating for me actually was how comfortable I felt with Jews, with Israelis. For me, it was like I was spending far more time, like after we had our discussions and everything was done, I would actually spend more time talking to Israelis than talking to Palestinians, than talking to Jordanians. I think maybe it was because I was always a bit, westernized, if you know what I mean. I liked going out for drinks. I liked, this lifestyle. And not everyone, Jordanians and the Palestinians, they're Muslims, so they don't do that stuff. I did, so maybe that was also, another. I also like to have a good time, so going out for a drink, and chatting with people is my idea of a good time. So I think that was one side, but this was the very first time I actually met Israelis. But before this, in 2011, I met somebody who's a very good friend of mine now, an American Jew who's actually, I think in many ways he changed my life because he actually answered many of my questions about Judaism. He's a very good friend, and I think in many ways, he guided me through this entire process, which ended up with me converting to Judaism in 2016. So I've known him in 2011, and this was all online because back then obviously I couldn't go to Israel. It was really a big thing, and it ended up with us being very very good friends, and he's actually the godfather of my son now. So it's a big thing now. But I think that's again a very long story. I think it's also, I can see how my own understanding of the conflict actually developed. So I would always, in 2014, when I met the Israelis and the Palestinians would always come to me and say something, which is the complete opposite of what they said privately. Like publicly, they say, publicly they say, oh, we want peace, blah, 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 blah. Privately, they come to me because I'm Egyptian, because, they believe that I'm a Muslim, just like an average guy. And they say things like, oh, we'll never have peace with Jews. It's basically, the whole two-state solution is a stepping stone towards having liberating all of Palestine. That's what they would say.
So then why did they, if I might interject, why did they come? Why did they go to these events that
It's
propose
actually it's actually a very interesting question. I don't think anyone does anything for one reason. It's for many reasons. Number one, you get to leave the Middle East for a while, go to Cyprus, have a week away, which is relaxing for everyone. It's good for everyone. So I understand this. Also, you have to play the game. It's a game. The whole sort of two-state solution. This thing is pretty much a game. They play this game, and Palestinians have been playing this game for decades. They go to the negotiations, and then they say, yes, we need a two-state solution, but we need to allow all refugees to come back, which is about 5 million Palestinians coming back to Israel. So essentially changing the entire land into a Palestinian Muslim land, which is just like, well, that's not going to happen. And then the talks collapse, and then somebody else comes. You've got, another American president who's very ambitious and wants to be like Biden, basically. He wants to resolve a conflict that has been ongoing for not decades, centuries, as I believe. And then he decides, oh, this is going to be my legacy. And then they restart the whole thing. And obviously there's a lot of money in it. We have to recognize this. There's a lot of money for Palestinians when it comes to, aid, when it comes to all sorts of stuff. So that's it. Yeah.
So you did your conversion online while living in Egypt?
No. I started my conversion when I came to the UK, because that had to be obviously in person, and it had to be, it's not something that can be done online. I actually remember writing to a Chabad rabbi in 2011 and saying, listen, I want to convert, let's go ahead. And I was very naive back then because, I was only 21. And he said, you can't do that. You live in Egypt, it's not going to be safe for you. It's not going to be possible. You can't just like sort of read a few things and never go to synagogue, and convert. How can you do that? So, yeah, but I was naive, it's something that, you don't really know much about. So, and also because it's a very interesting comparison. Anyone can convert and be a Muslim. So if somebody tomorrow started, like tomorrow just woke up and decided, I want to be a Muslim, all this person has to do is just say the Shahada, which is, say that, you believe in Allah and you believe in Muhammad as his prophet. That's it. Voila, you're a Muslim. So from my understanding and my background, was just like, well, why can't I convert to Judaism? If I want to convert to Judaism, why is it so complicated?
Yeah. Welcome to Judaism.
Yes, exactly.
Why is it so complicated? That's like that's the advertisement for us. So why did you leave Egypt and go to UK?
So I left Egypt because I just realized there was no place for me there. Really, it was different reasons. It wasn't safe for me to be who I am. There in Egypt, it just wasn't. I mean, you'll probably see that in the number of death threats I keep getting online and accusations of being on the Mossad's payroll and all. So it's just, I mean, and also death threats and threats from Egyptians telling me, if you dare, come to Cairo and we'll deal with you, all that stuff. So it's very obvious, it's just not for me at all. So I just decided, you know what, that's it.
It's absolutely a completely unique story. Have you met any other Egyptians? Have you met anyone with even a comparable story like yours?
One guy, yes, I did actually meet one guy who was his story is very personal. I don't want to get into it because
Sure.
his story is not political at all. It's very, very personal in the sense that he was not really accepted for who he was when it comes to his sexuality as a Muslim. So he decided, you know what, it's just not for me, to be part of a faith that believes I should be killed for who I am, for being gay. So that's why he converted. He just decided, I'll just see another religion that I think fits who I am, and so that's the only guy, but I don't know anyone else now.
So, since we're already talking about life inside Egypt, let's talk about the anti-Semitism itself, the Muslim Brotherhood, what their role is or was in the proliferation of this. My understanding is that Egypt is the source of the anti-Israel ideology that just is spread out throughout the Arab world. Can you tell me more about that?
I think, to be honest, and I'll have to admit, there's one thing that annoys me about this conversation slightly when I have with a few people online, when they seem to be talking a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood, like it's the Muslim Brotherhood is the main reason for anti-Semitism, and it's not for many reasons. First and foremost, anti-Semitism, Arab anti-Semitism, is part of. It's at the very heart of Arab national identity. Muslim Brotherhood is, in a way, a fringe group. It's not, especially in Egypt. I'll talk about Egypt specifically. So let's say I went to school, and there were like 20 kids in my class. Uh, one or two would be actually Muslim Brotherhood. And by saying Muslim Brotherhood, their parents would be Muslim Brotherhood. And actually, Muslim Brotherhood members usually intermarry. So they would marry somebody who's, like, basically it's sort of a religion of its own in a way, like it's a very certain interpretation of Islam. It's a very certain interpretation of vision, basically, and that vision unites those people. But the Muslim Brotherhood and influence is actually not that big in Egypt for many reasons. You have to look at since the 40s, 1948, and the establishment of the State of Israel. They were actually somewhat accepted because of one reason, because they said, let's do jihad against Israel, and let's do jihad against the British who were occupying Egypt back then. So they were seen as a nationalist religious movement that is basically advocating for the liberation of Egypt and Muslims. But after Nasser takes over in 1952, it completely changes. Nasser takes over in 1952, and what happens is you have somebody who is essentially persecuting the Muslim Brotherhood. So he puts them, in prison. He targets them, and actually Sayyid Qutb, who's basically the godfather of Islamic Jihad, who's basically the man who first, in modern times, actually revived jihad in many ways in his writings and everything. And he's put, in prison and then actually executed for terrorism. So since then, since Nasser took over, the military took over in 1952. Somebody who was, an army officer taking over, basically ruling Egypt, and then you have obviously, from Nasser and afterwards, and then you come to Mubarak, and then you come to Sisi, and they all have a military background. So they all view the Muslim Brotherhood as a serious and credible, actually the most serious threat to Egypt. So they don't really have a massive influence on Egyptian politics in the sense that, shaping the views of Egyptians, because also Egyptians are very terrified of being called Muslim Brotherhood. Because if anyone says in Egypt, like let's say your neighbor has an issue with you, like you fight over, parking space or whatever. If he says you're Muslim Brotherhood, you're going to be arrested. You're going to be, that's it basically, and you're going to have some sort of you're going to be monitored by national security. You're going to be, so it's not something that it's something that terrifies everyone basically.
Because why are they so anti-Muslim Brotherhood?
Because the Egyptians see them as a threat, because the government sees them as a threat, a threat in the sense that they are basically jihadists, they are, terrorists, and they threaten the whole system of governance in Egypt. So, the Egyptians do not want to be, Afghanistan. And that's just not Egypt, by the way. That's Morocco, that's Tunisia. You're going to see this everywhere across North Africa. So I don't think, again, that's, putting the Muslim Brotherhood in context. But the thing is, anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiments are actually part of the national identity of Egyptians generally. So, hating Israel, seeing Israel as the enemy, is just who you are. You're taught this. You're taught this in history books. You're taught this in school. You're taught this everywhere. And also, there is this sense that for Egyptians, they believe that the Yom Kippur War ended with a victory for the Egyptians. So they are given the sense that this is the greatest achievement for Egyptians. So you cannot deny them this sense of, nationalist pride. Because if you take that away, then Egypt does not really have a lot of achievements since 1952. And that's a fact, because the economy has been going from bad to worse since 1952. Egypt lost, the Sinai in 1967. So if you look at all this, you're going to see a very bleak and very grim history, except for the 1973 war, which is, again, what Egyptians believe, is the proudest moment in their existence. Yes.
No, please. So you say that it's a Arab national identity. And we talked last week with Robert Spencer, who brought hadith after hadith about it being a religious idea, absolutely part and parcel, inseparable from the religious ideology. But you're saying national. So where is the difference there?
Well, it's actually a bit of both, because it is nationalist 100%, because when I say collective national identity, part of it is religion, part of it is nationalism. This is the melting pot of of the Egyptian identity. So there is obviously a great deal of it is related to religious convictions. That's a fact. But I met millions of people who do not know the hadith, millions of people who do not really, not millions, I didn't mean millions, I met hundreds of people who do not know. That's a fact of life. There are millions of people in Egypt who are not religious. They're not, they don't pray the 5 times a day. They don't, but they still believe in this. It's part of who they are, because this is part of their national collective identity. And I think what happened also, which was very intelligent in Egypt, was mixing this religious and nationalist side. So it becomes your national identity to be against Israel, as in the sense that you are called a traitor and a collaborator if you believe that Israel should exist. But also there is a religious side to it, because they believe that eventually, when the end of time comes, there will be a war between Muslims and Jews. So really, it's inseparable in many ways. I think what happens is, it depends on the person. It depends on who you are. So you're going to find that the more religious people look at the religious aspect of it. The less religious people look at the nationalist aspect of it. But regardless, it's just a melting pot that you cannot separate. It's very much their vision for the future. It's how they view the past and how they view themselves, basically.
Well, that's very interesting. It leads us to that second oldest synagogue, that second oldest cemetery that you mentioned, which clearly indicates there was once upon a time a rich Jewish community there. And then there isn't anymore, if you want to say.
Yes.
History for many people, yeah.
It is tragic, because Egypt had, I think, at its peak before 1948, before the war in 1948, it actually had around 85,000 Jews. So it was really quite strong, and they were in many ways very, very active in business, in politics. But by the way, it's actually very interesting because when you look before 1948, Egypt even had Freemasonry, which is something that's exists now in Israel. It exists in the UK. It exists in the US. Egypt had also very liberal societies. Egypt had even prostitution was legal in Egypt before 1948. And after 1948, the war comes, and then Nasser takes over in 1952, and all this changes. So Freemasonry is banned as a secret, elitist Zionist society, and political parties are banned. And then you have prostitution is obviously banned, and Egypt starts to take this pan-Arab Islamist view for the rest of its existence until this very day today. That's what a lot of people miss. A lot of people, when they look at Egypt, they think, oh, Muslim, we can't do this. But actually, before 1948, a lot of Egyptians used to drink beer. A lot of Egyptians most Egyptians actually never had the hijab on. So all this started, again from 1948, when Egypt started to become more nationalist, more ideological, more Islamist. And I think now, I think it was 2022, and someone I know visited Egypt and actually met with the Jewish community in Egypt. And I think there are only 6 Jews left in Egypt now. So, yes.
Do you see the country as getting more religious, more Islamist?
Uh, in a way, yes, but no, because you get this new generation, the younger generation, which is, it's a very cool generation. It's a generation that uses social media. It's a generation that, they don't even dress very modestly, like, not in a very religious way, but they still have this Islamist nationalist view, which is absolutely terrifying because in many ways they seem to be very, open-minded. They seem to be very, 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 westernized in the way they dress and everything. But sadly, it's the exact opposite. They're actually very much like their grandparents, if you will. So that's the challenge. And I think for me, I find this scary because how do you can't even like, if you're somebody who's dressed very religiously, then you know what to expect from this person. But if you have somebody who's very modern, very westernized, then that's a different story.
Right, right. So in thinking of this, so this was an idea that I had learned, but know minimally about that. This was what I had heard, that Muslim Brotherhood had been the source of this proliferation of anti-Semitism. So where would you say, or is that your take, that this is something that is embedded in the religion and is taken in from the religious ideology to the nationalists across the Muslim world? Why is it so pervasive? I mean, we see multiple accounts of Hitler glorification, storefronts with such names, Mein Kampf, found in a lot of rooms inside Gaza. I mean, that's going there in a very deliberate way. Where would you say that's coming from? Is it sort of just this sort of justification that they've brought from the outside in?
So no, it's not from the outside in actually, because it's Islam started as a political movement, and somebody actually said this very recently. I think it was Sam Harris, which was absolutely mind blowing. I don't know why I never thought of it this way. But if you look at Moses, and by the way, the story of Moses is almost identical in the Quran. For Muslims, they believe that they don't believe that he was Jewish, they believe that he was Muslim. But the story, in the sense of, confronting Pharaoh and all that stuff, it's all the same. The story of Jesus is also almost all the same, but they do believe that he was a Muslim. So they believe that all of the prophets and everyone from Muhammad and everyone before him, well, basically from Adam, to Muhammad, which is, they believe that this is a whole, series of prophets. They believe they're all Muslim. However, the story is all the same. The difference is that you have Muhammad, who is a warlord. You have Muhammad, who is the head of a political movement. You have Muhammad, who's the only one, if you compare him between him and Moses and Jesus, you're going to see that Muhammad was the only one who actually established a state, a religious state.
You there?
Yeah, yes, yes.
Goodness. Sorry for that.
It's okay. Yeah. So Muhammad was the only one who established a state. He's the only one who said, this is what you have to do. You have to take taxes, called jizya from non-Muslims, and from Muslims it's called zakah, which is like sadaqah. So he's the only one who did this. So Islam in itself is a political movement, and when it started around the year 625, it actually started when Muhammad basically ethnically cleansed Jews from Arabia. So that is very much part of the religious identity of Muslims, and this is what happened wherever we saw them go. That always happened. Now, Muslims would obviously argue against this, but the argument is really quite it doesn't hold water basically. So it's not really from the outside in, but what happened is you had a lot of outsider impact basically, which reinforced these convictions. So then you had, the protocols of the elders of Zion, which was embraced almost immediately. Mein Kampf, which was embraced almost immediately. And we're very unlucky in a way, because I think it was obvious that the Egyptians wanted to be liberated from the occupation, of the British. That's normal, it's normal that Egyptians would want, to rule their own country themselves. But the problem is, the only ones standing in the way of this happening were actually the West. And the West was very supportive of Israel, not initially, by the way, as we all know, but that's how Egyptians see it, that the West is very supportive of Israel. So Israel is occupation, Israel is oppression. So you feel like there is this narrative that is built with everything. Obviously there is the inside force, the Islam and nationalism. And then there is protocols, like I said, which is actually from Russia originally. And then you have the influence of Nazism, who were actually very much supportive of Egyptian liberation from the British. So it all sort of, again, the Arab world becomes this melting pot of Nazism, Islamism, and it's absolutely horrifying. But this is why it's so difficult to get rid of, and it's so difficult to actually root it out. But mostly, it's because, and I said this recently, one example that you have to look at Saudi Arabia. A couple of years ago, women could not drive. And then you had the scholars, Muslim scholars saying, yes, women should not drive, because if women drive, they will have sex with men, they will have, they will get all sorts of, it was all, they basically had their fatwas, which are the religious rulings, justifying this ban on driving. When Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman took over and decided, you know what, we're going to let women drive, the clergy and the Muslim scholars found justifications for his decision, and they decided to justify this. So the problem, I believe, is that we, especially in Egypt, we've never had a president who is willing to stand publicly and say anti-Semitism is a serious problem in our society. President Sisi is actually the closest you can get to this, but he has not gone anywhere near far enough.
It's pretty incredible how completely this anti-Semitism permeates the entire Arab world. You're talking about whatever number you want to choose, 1.8 billion people, and you see singular people you can count on one or two hands who are interested in peace, who are speaking aloud about peace. You don't even have so much as a signed letter by a bunch of professionals, 15 of them, 20 of them, throughout the entire Arab world. You don't hear that an iota out of people calling for peace. It's so complete. It seems almost rare. Certainly, anyone who has any idea of what is happening in Gaza and how Hamas behaves understands that to even initiate peace or anything even remotely except full cheering on Hamas, I guess, would put your life at risk.
Yes.
But even in places that are less extreme, you don't hear it. There's not been a single march for peace or for normalization in the entire Arab world, not during this time or before.
The exception, I would say, is the UAE. That is the only exception where you have a country that is actually very much invested in normalization. And you can see the difference between Egypt and the UAE very clearly. So, for instance, the Camp David Accords actually includes a section on tourism, promoting tourism. So, the whole point was that this would not be a cold peace as it is now, it would be actually a warm peace. And Egyptians would go to Israel on tourism, and Israelis would go to the Sinai on tourism. So the Egyptians took the part of this which is financially attractive for them, basically, and decided to accept Israelis into Sinai without visas. It's very easy to go from Israel to Sinai, and hundreds of thousands of people do it. I have a lot of Israeli friends who've been doing it for years. But no Egyptians can go to Israel. If you even suggest that you're going to go to Israel, first you have security checks. So you're going to be treated as a spy if you want to go to Israel on tourism. And then you've got the actual logistical challenges because there are not many flights. So it becomes, again, very obvious that the Israelis decided, yes, we want to have this very warm relationship. So we're going to let our people go to Sinai, have a good time, spend money. And the Egyptians did not do the same. They decided, no, we're going to essentially ban our people from going to Israel, and we're going to shun everyone who decides to do it and accuse them of being a Mossad spy. So that's very obvious, and this has been consistently ongoing for decades. And I think for me, what I find really challenging is why the Americans did not decide to do anything about this. The Americans just decided, you know what, we've got the Camp David. This is a huge achievement for American foreign policy. Let's leave it as it is. Let's not sort of, challenge the Egyptians. Let's not really, rock the boat. Just leave it as it is. And I think this is a huge mistake. Because if this had not happened, if 10 years ago, 20 years ago, Egyptians had started going to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv, and actually getting to meet the people, I don't think we would have had this scale of anti-Semitism. I don't think it would not have been anywhere near as bad. And also, you have to see there are different aspects to it, but this is, I think, is very boring to talk about. But when you look at, for instance, how Egyptian authorities are actually holding those who promote anti-Semitism accountable. For instance, if there is this, celebrity who makes, a video or, a TV series that's very anti-Semitic, nothing happens to them. In fact, it actually becomes more popular than other TV series. So they should hold those people accountable and say, listen, that's not okay. This is discrimination, but it doesn't happen. It's very obvious. And I think you'll see again a lot of Egyptians commenting and saying to me, no, we're not anti-Semitic. We're just anti-Zionist, which is which is what we see now Europeans even saying, which is far more depressing than anything else, really.
Right. It's also evidently not the case.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna read you something since we're already talking about visiting Israel, which, by the way, I've seen so many different people who say I was anti-Israel, I was ABCDFG nature of that nature, and they came to Israel and then they realize the reality versus the outstanding propaganda that Israel fails at countering completely, so it seems. So I 100% agree that were people to be able to actually come and be on the ground and experience the reality, the way we live all together, this idea of people saying, Jews and Israel and Arabs really could live in peace. It's like, duh. We've been doing it for 75 years, I mean, obviously, in the daily, you go into Hadassah, the most world famous hospital in the world, and it is I can tell you I had to visit there myself. The Bakhir, the head of the neurology department, is an Arab man. I mean, this is our lives. So with that, I'm going to read you something with that in mind. 1977, in a move that shocked the world, Anwar Sadat announced he was willing to go to Jerusalem to make peace with Israel. Once the Israelis understood that this was for real, Menachem Begin promptly invited Sadat to Jerusalem. In the groundbreaking trip to Israel, Sadat stayed in Jerusalem and addressed the Knesset. This was incredible. That only a few years earlier, Sadat had launched the Yom Kippur War against Israel, and the two countries had been bitter enemies. Yet with an act of courage, Israeli children were seen waving Israeli and Egyptian flags together. This trip led to the Camp David Peace Accords, which brought Israel its first peace treaty. Even though it may be a cold peace, it was a major achievement for Israel. In Menachem Begin's speech during Sadat's visit to the Knesset, he said, I quote, I greet the president of Egypt on the occasion of his visit to our country and his participation in this session of the Knesset. The duration of the flight from Cairo to Jerusalem is short, but until last night, the distance between them was infinite. So, Khaled, how far today is the distance between Cairo and Jerusalem, would you say?
I think sadly it's getting farther and farther, to be honest, which is something that I find especially disappointing, because I love President Sadat, and I actually posted on visiting his residence, by the way, and I visited his hometown at the invitation of his family, by the way, which they have a little museum for President Sadat, which includes the shirt that he had on when he was shot with his own blood on it. So President Sadat is also seen as by many as a brilliant strategist. He was absolutely fascinating in every way and very brave. But I think for me, I had hoped that that in my generation we would see, people taking a train from Cairo to Jerusalem. This was my hope. Just like you do here, you take a train from London to Paris very easily, nothing happens, despite decades of conflict between the English and the French. So this was my hope. I think today, to be honest, it does seem that I mean, as an intelligence analyst, a professional intelligence analyst, I have to separate between two things: an actual assessment that is based on fact, and my own prediction, which is based on a gut feeling, if you will, or an understanding of Egyptian society and the Egyptian decision makers. I can tell you that my assessment, based on the actual facts, shows that it's the risk of an actual serious confrontation between the Israelis and the Egyptians is actually higher than it's ever been. Now, if you ask me what my gut feeling, based on personally knowing Egyptian decision makers, I would tell you that I believe that this year or next year, probably something really horrible will happen in Sinai, because I have a lot of questions about Sinai. This could be, something else that the Israelis discover, more tunnels, more, I don't know, Hamas activity in Sinai that the Egyptians could not detect, which could lead to, horrific consequences and repercussions for everyone. And potentially also, there is a likelihood of separatist movements in Sinai. There is a likelihood of, militancy in Sinai basically being triggered again, reignited again, because of all that's happening. So there are serious risks that I believe will materialize over the next few months and potentially the next couple of years.
And you think that's as a result of the confrontation happening right now in Gaza?
I think it's not a direct result of it. It's in a way. So the situation in Sinai is very complicated for many reasons, because Egypt is not allowed to have a lot of military basically presence in Sinai, according to the Camp David. And there is coordination between the Israelis and the Egyptians. But I do have a lot of questions on what's happening in Sinai. For instance, on the 1st of May, there was this new organization that was founded. It's called the Union of the Sinai Tribes. And this organization is led by a man called Ibrahim al-Arghani. Ibrahim al-Arghani is, Sheikh Ibrahim al-Arghani. He's the head of these tribes now. And these tribes were, well, this organization was actually armed. And they were armed because they were involved in helping the Egyptian military, basically in its counter-terrorism operations across the Sinai. Now they've become an independent entity. And a couple of days ago, I think it was 3 or 4 days ago, a delegation from Qatar visited Ibrahim al-Arghani himself and promised to invest in Sinai, promised to increase its investment. So it seems to me that Ibrahim al-Arghani is linked to different organizations and is also backed by different governments, which for me is very suspicious. There are so many questions around who he is, where he's taking Sinai, because he seems to be positioning himself as the de facto ruler of Sinai. Now, this could be some sort of reward given to him by the Egyptians because he's been, very active and very helpful in countering the, terrorist threat in Sinai. So that's understandable. But also, there are so many questions that we do not have any answers to. If the Qataris are getting involved, if he has some sort of links to the Qataris, who are the backers, financial backers of Hamas, then was he at any point involved in building tunnels? Was he at any point involved in smuggling weapons? That we do not know. So it's especially that the Bedouins know Sinai really, really well. I think, you also know this in Israel. The Bedouins know the Negev really well. It's very difficult to end all of their smuggling activity. It's very difficult to end all of even, drug trafficking and all this. So it's a very, very challenging situation. And I think there is a concept that we always talk about in intelligence, and it's the limitation of intelligence. We don't have enough answers on who this man is, what his intentions are, what the Egyptians want him to do or do not want him to do, what his links are to the Qatari government, because he was presented as an actual minister of state, for instance, receiving a delegation from Qatar. And this delegation was offering him and promising him to increase their investments in Sinai. And that all seems very odd, if you ask me, because we have somebody here who's, on what authority is he acting as a head of state?
Absolutely.
So there are a lot of questions, but I think we also need to highlight that the Egyptian government, actually Caroline Glick wrote an article about this that I think, to be honest, is very problematic in many ways, because she was suggesting that Egypt was actually a sponsor of Hamas. And we don't have any evidence of this because Egypt has been fighting Hamas. Egypt has been destroying the tunnels and building a buffer zone between Gaza and Sinai, which extends to, at its widest, about 5 kilometers inland in Egypt. So that's a real challenge. We have a lot of evidence that shows that President Sisi is actively and openly destroying these tunnels, countering Hamas in many ways. And that continued, by the way, until at least 2020. The Egyptian army continued to destroy tunnels until at least 2020. But then now we have all of these other questions, and obviously it's very understanding that Israelis are suspicious, because Israelis have, on the other side, a nation that is very proudly and openly supporting Hamas. And now they discover tunnels, and now there is this happening, and it's all raising so many questions. And obviously, people are concerned. Israelis have been, murdered and raped and taken hostage. There's also the other side, which unfortunately there is not a lot of regional influence left for Egypt, because Egypt is, the economy is not great. A lot of what's happening in the region is very problematic and very difficult to deal with. But then you get this point where Egypt maintains a lot of its influence in the region, which is the part it plays as mediator between Hamas and Israel. Right. Which means that the U.S., you'll always see, Biden, and before him Obama, and before, all those U.S. presidents basically making statements saying thanks to the Egyptian president for mediating. We're very grateful, blah blah blah, and this gives Egyptians the sense of maintaining the regional influence.
Mm-hmm.
So if Hamas goes, if Hamas is no more, then Egypt loses a huge deal of its regional influence, especially in terms of the Arab-Palestinian conflict. So that also raises a lot of questions. The Egyptians, do they want Hamas to survive? Because that means that they maintain this regional influence, which also, by the way, meant that the Americans are less likely to withhold military aid because the Egyptians are helping with this. We can't withhold military aid if the Egyptians are helping in the conflict. And also the Gulf states like UAE and Saudi Arabia helping the Egyptians because obviously they don't want a disaster at their doorstep. So these are all questions that I think need to be raised. And quite honestly, I said this and I'm going to say this again. The Egyptian government has always maintained secret communication with the Israelis. So it's always Mossad and the Egyptian intelligence talking to each other. I think we need to publicly talk. We need to say now enough is enough. I think we need to understand that integrity is doing what you say and saying what you do. And you need to come public and just say, listen, we're coming clean. This is what we're doing. This is what we expect. This is what we want. It is not okay. And I think I said this again recently, and it's actually quite unbelievable why no one is saying this. It's a perfect example of the boy who cried wolf. When you have a nation that is very openly and proudly supporting Hamas, but secretly going to Israel and saying, you know what, we don't like Hamas. Well, that doesn't work anymore because, you have to have your public image. If you publicly are saying this, then people are going to take you for it. They're going to take your word for it and say, okay, well, you support Hamas then. And that's a challenge as well.
Right. So there's a few things I want to say from that. One is I think that you're right. It was one thing to sort of keep, like you said, keep the public image. Of course, we hate Israel, but get your aid and your cold peace deals, whatever it was. But of course, post October 7th, for good and for bad, those divisions, you can't play both sides.
Yeah.
Right? You need to pick a plan. You are either encouraging exactly what you said so emphatically. If you don't want Muslim Brotherhood, then you don't want Hamas.
Yes.
And something that's important that people should know, the US gives Egypt about $1.2 billion in aid, but they have been withholding it due to human rights violations in Egypt. So there is also some tension from that side.
It's very challenging because I think it's actually one of the most interesting interviews. And again, this is something that most people would not know. So Amr Musa, who was a former minister of foreign affairs in Egypt, and he was basically Mubarak's foreign policy expert. And he was asked this question in an interview not long ago after October 7th. He said, somebody asked him, we hate the Muslim Brotherhood. It was during an Egyptian talk show. And the host asked him, he said, Egypt hates the Muslim Brotherhood. We fight the Muslim Brotherhood. We designate them as terrorist organization. Well, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Why don't we do the same? And it was a very curious answer because he said publicly, yes, you're right, we do this, but we have to make a separation between Hamas as a resistance movement and Hamas as a Muslim Brotherhood offshoot. So basically what he's saying is we have double standards. This needs to end. It needs to end. You cannot look at Hamas one day and say, all right, you're a resistance movement. That's when they're killing Jews. That's when they're fighting Jews, kidnapping kids and babies. And then the other day you look at them and decide, no, you're coming towards my border now. You're supporting the Muslim Brotherhood now. You're supporting terrorists in Sinai. So now you're a terrorist organization and I need to, take a step away from you. You can't do this. You're going to have to decide, It's obviously clear. But I think, to be honest, this does not surprise me at all because it's always been, when it comes to jihad, and that's also one of the main problems in Egypt. So Egypt was actually one of the very first countries where they used suicide bombings in their fight against the British. Suicide bombings and assassinations. It was basically, this Islamist jihad kind in the 1940s and 1950s. And most Egyptians, even the most liberal Egyptians, would tell you that's fine. If we're targeting occupiers in the sense of, British occupiers, then that's fine. And they would even argue that Haganah did it, Irgun did it, and that's fine. But they make a distinction when those jihadists start targeting Egyptian Muslims. So that's when it becomes a problem. So jihad is okay as long as it's targeting Jews and non-Muslims, but it's bad when it starts targeting Muslim, Egyptian, politicians. And this is where you need to draw a line. And this is where actually the UAE really stands out. The UAE says no to jihad. Under all circumstances, jihad is not okay. So that's why the UAE is completely and entirely on a different level of, I believe, as a civilized society. They completely reject jihad. They do not say jihad is okay against our enemies. No, jihad is a no-no. And I think this needs to be made very clear. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. So I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime, to be honest. So we can only hope.
Well, I mean, it's pretty short-sighted to not imagine that same jihad that you don't want for yourself, you're going to have to stamp out in its entirety. But right, not today and not tomorrow, but it doesn't hurt to hope. So let's get into why has Egypt been so emphatically against the Rafah operation? What are they afraid of?
I mean, they're not afraid of. Well, they are afraid of a few things, but it's not a fear of. I mean, a lot of Israelis have been saying, "Oh, they're afraid that you might find out that Egypt has tunnels." I don't think this is not the main fear. Obviously, there is an element of embarrassment because I think there is an element of showing everyone that maybe the Egyptians overestimate their own capabilities when they say we're doing this, we've destroyed all the tunnels, but actually they failed to discover some tunnels, or some tunnels were basically were basically built and they didn't even find out by the Bedouins or anyone else, or corrupt corrupt politicians and decision makers. But it's very, very complicated, and actually even the recent announcement by an anonymous official who is a very senior official. That's how Egypt works sometimes. When somebody wants, in the intelligence wants to make a statement, and they don't want it to be attributed to the intelligence or military intelligence or whatever, they just use whatever platform in Egypt and say just attribute it to an anonymous senior official. So an anonymous senior official recently said, we are struggling basically to contain and entirely control the repercussions of the Rafah offensive, which means, in a way, that the Egyptians are very worried that some unauthorized attacks would happen. If Egyptian soldiers see Israeli soldiers, they're just going to shoot at them. That is one serious fear. They are really seriously worried about this. And like I said, the regional influence inside, because they don't want Hamas to be completely wiped out, because if it is, then Egypt does not really maintain much of, its regional influence. But there is also another side that's very interesting. Hamas itself wants Egypt to have a confrontation with the Israelis. So Hamas will do whatever it can to make that happen.
You mean like putting their launchers right on the crossing and sticking a Jeep full of explosives right in the camp that's just been made? Do you mean like that?
Exactly. All this. So this is deliberate. This is not a joke. Hamas is very serious when it comes to this. They want to do this, and they also have a last resort.
Since the 90s. So they've got a lot of experience. You got to excel at something. So there you go.
Yes. And they also have something else in their arsenal, which is a last resort. If they find that they're getting completely eradicated by the IDF, what they can do is blow up part of the wall that separates Gaza from Sinai.
Oh, wow.
So the problem becomes, it's not only Israel's problem, it also becomes Egypt's problem. Now, the Egyptian army cannot be seen shooting at Palestinian civilians. That would be huge. Although the Egyptian army has actually said publicly that any attempts to infiltrate the border, will be met with lethal force. So they're making it very clear: if you try to come into Egypt and infiltrate Egypt, and this is aimed at Hamas and Palestinians, obviously, because it's not Israelis who will be trying to cross. And they said, if you try to do this, we'll shoot you. It's as
Right.
simple.
And the what, 6 or 7 or 8 fences they put up
Yes,
between.
exactly.
It's
But
not subtle. Right.
it's not subtle. But if you have a situation here where if Hamas blows up part of this fence, then Egypt will be automatically dragged into this conflict. They will have to make a very difficult decision of either shooting at Palestinians or letting them in. And they don't want to make that decision. So the easiest thing to do is ask Israel to stop its Rafah operation.
Why did they so emphatically not want the Palestinians to come in?
I
Rhetorical
mean, that's,
question.
there are so many answers to this, but let's put it this way: Egypt
Yeah.
has around 9 million refugees from Sudan, from Libya, from Lebanon. They don't want more. And also, Palestinians, if they come in, there will be a threat of the Palestinians setting base in Sinai and targeting the Israelis. And no one wants this for very obvious reasons.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
What are other security concerns that Egypt has in the region? Certainly obvious what's happening right along their borders, but what is their position with other nations?
I mean, they obviously have the threat from Libya, terrorism from Libya, and then the unrest in Sudan, which has led to a lot of refugees. That's really challenging. But nothing really stands out as much as this conflict in Rafah now.
Right. So you mentioned that in 2020, so Egypt took upon itself to clear out tunnels to their best of the ability, because it really is a question how the legendary Israeli intelligence combined with Egypt's didn't detect tunnels big enough to drive a car through, which clearly have been funneling tremendous amounts of artillery and potentially much worse. What are your thoughts? And you mentioned something again that happened in 2020 that might have changed the.
So the challenge here is we have to be
Mhm.
very honest, and we also have to recognize that even Israel did not uncover a lot of the tunnels that existed, even very close to the Rafah Crossing. Even, obviously, all of that equipment that went into Gaza, and Israel's intelligence is far superior to the Egyptians. We have to recognize this. The Egyptians will never say this to you, and publicly, because they will feel like ashamed of saying, "Listen, Israeli intelligence is better than ours," and they themselves did not discover a lot of that stuff. So it's not only the Israelis. You've got the Israelis, you've got the Americans. The Americans have a lot of investments, intelligence investments in the region, and they didn't discover a lot of that stuff. So I think, again, this is my advice to the Egyptians. They need to come clean and they need to say this. Like, if I was an Egyptian decision maker, this is what I would do. I would say, listen, we just didn't find out. Whether it's ineptitude or whatever, we did not find out about these. We had no knowledge of these tunnels. Just like Israel did not have knowledge of October 7th, or did not have knowledge of the scale of October 7th, or even the equipment and the weapons that would be used in October 7th, as well as the tunnels that were just a couple of 100 feet from the Rafah Crossing. So there are many questions. I will tell you, I honestly don't know. This is my own estimation that the Egyptians maybe did not know. There is also potentially a bit of corruption. So Egypt, in a usual game of chess, you're gonna have two players. If you know one player, you can predict their movements. But unfortunately, when it comes to Egypt and most of the Arab world, every piece of chess has got a mind of its own. It's got interests of its own. So the fact that some tunnels were discovered across the border, it doesn't mean that Sisi knows about them. It may very well be that he never found out, and this was the doing of somebody else. This was the doing of Bedouins. This was the doing of even some local authorities who were corrupt, and he never knew, because Egypt is huge. And the government's capabilities to actually govern all of Egypt is not as strong as I wish it was. So that's, there are so many questions. Like I said, I don't have all the answers, but I think the Egyptians at least have the ability to clarify their position. They can go publicly and say, listen, we did not know about these tunnels. And that at least would give the Israelis and Americans, everyone else, the sense of relief. But now we know you didn't know. Maybe we can work together on, developing some sort of, strategy to secure this fence. But the problem is they actually resisted this because the Israelis reportedly had offered, before going into Rafah, they had offered some sort of mutual agreement to police the border together and have some sensors and have some, all of that stuff. And according to media reports, the Egyptians refused repeatedly, which is what I do not understand. So why would you refuse to work with the Israelis? I think it's a question for the Egyptians, to be honest.
Yeah. You said that the man who was basically running Sinai, you said that you believe there was a cooperation to keep the tunnels clean in that whole area until 2020. Did something change at that time?
No, the military's operations started in 2014 to clear this area. They started in 2014 and lasted until 2020. They built a complete buffer zone. So that's what I'm referring to. I think they achieved their goals in 2020, which is why it stopped. Well, that's as far as I know. I don't really, again, it's in many ways, Sinai is this mysterious place where not a lot of people have access to information and actually, can inspect Sinai in many ways. So that's the challenge. And like I said, they need to present information and they need to just, not entirely dismiss everything and just, expect it to just basically, just go away. You have to be honest and you have to address these concerns and challenges.
If only politicians would be able to do that. Is there anything else, Khaled, that you feel would help flesh out our understanding of the region, the concerns, the conflicts, or any reading anywhere, anything else you want to add to this picture?
No, not really. I just it's an ongoing conversation. I think we're going to find out more information, in the next few months and weeks. I'll always keep posting about this. I'll always keep talking about this, and I think hopefully my understanding and everyone's understanding will also continue to develop as the more information we have. So for now, I think we've done our best really trying to explain this. And like I said, my only hope is that the Egyptians would actually basically explain themselves, clarify the position, and disclose more information on what's happening, because all of this is leading to a lot of speculation, which is not helpful.
Right. And meantime, while there's a deep concern about the Camp David Accords, they're still intact as of now. And whatever you need to cross to keep hoping that they do stand. But we'll see. We'll see how things play out, and certainly be interested to hear your thoughts on what develops. Can only hope for the best.
Yes,
Whatever.
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Khaled. And again, we can find you on Twitter. Khaled, you say please your handle there.
Yes, it's Khaled. So my name Khaled, H Zakaria with a H in the end. So,
right.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was awesome to speak with you, and more soon.
Thanks very much. Speak soon.
Thank you.